Taking a leap of faith is rarely simple, but with the right knowledge, perspective and support, it can be the most rewarding step you'll ever take. Today's guest is tackling a part of the aesthetics industry that many people know is a problem, but very few seem willing to properly address. I'm joined today by Brea Cannady, founder of PREPÆRE, aiming to bring mental health into the treatment room with wellbeing check-ins for clinics. She's created a pre-consultation risk infrastructure platform designed to improve informed consent, expectation management and patient education in cosmetic medicine. Her perspective is grounded in lived experience. Brea speaks openly about her own history with body dysmorphia, something estimated to affect nearly a quarter of cosmetic patients, and how this shapes both her understanding of the industry and the product she's building. Brea Cannady, welcome to The Leap.
Thank you for having me.
I'm really excited to have you here today. We first met at Aesthetic Medicine Live, I believe about a year ago, and I was genuinely impressed by your mission. So I'm particularly pleased that you're here. Before we start talking about PREPÆRE, take me back to the beginning, because this isn't an obvious path for a UCL physics graduate who ended up working in finance and consulting. What was your career like before you started PREPÆRE?
So I always say I have like the most random career path, as you said, it physics with medical physics at UCL, and then kind of moved into finance. I originally wanted to get into investment banking, then kind of ended up in investment consulting for a boutique, and then eventually joined Barclays Private Bank as part of the business development team. So my role there was basically speaking to ultra high net worths, particularly entrepreneurs. So that was really useful for me to hear so many successful business owners' experience of how they got into whatever industry they operate in and kind of how they've built their businesses and what they've learned along the way. So having that kind of secondhand experience was, I think, really valuable for me. But so I was at Barclays for about a year before eventually leaving and focusing on what started as a passion project and then turned into like a full-time thing.
Excellent. I mean, it sounds like quite a varied career, and as you said, the people around you influenced you to become an entrepreneur. Okay. So tell us about PREPÆRE. What is it and how does it work? And where did you first get the idea that sparked it?
Yeah, so let me start at the beginning. I think I'm going to start with my personal experience just very briefly of how I actually got into the aesthetics sector, because it is quite random. You don't necessarily see the path from physics and finance. I have personal experience with body dysmorphic disorder and eating disorders. I did ballet when I was really young, and that kind of shapes the way you see yourself and your body image, and very often leads to a lot of body image issues. And having had that experience, that's kind of something that has been with me my whole life. And I didn't even know what body dysmorphic disorder or BDD was until I was in my probably early 20s or something like that. And I only found out because I had very unnecessary cosmetic surgery on my body twice, because I literally could not see the difference. So basically when I was probably about 20 or so, 21, just around finishing university, I decided to get a breast reduction on a B cup, because in my head I was like completely deformed and like disproportionate. And I just found a surgeon, and it was just so incredibly easy to get the surgery. That's obviously very invasive and under full anesthesia. So, you just find a surgeon, they just kind of do the physical checks, but there isn't much in terms of a consultation about motivations and expectations. Looking back, my expectations were completely unrealistic. I mean, and again, that's not something that I would be able to put my finger on at the time, because it seemed completely reasonable to me. But obviously my hope was that the depression was going to go away and, my life will be so much easier. I'm not going to have to worry about my appearance all the time. And I thought the surgery would solve that. And when I've had the first surgery and I could not see any difference, or more accurately, I couldn't feel any difference, I decided to have it again because I thought this must be a fault of the surgeon. They haven't done what I asked for. It was genuinely to a point that was absolutely delusional, and it didn't really matter how many people told me, you know, oh, you're perfectly fine. There is nothing wrong with you. But I just couldn't see that that was in my head. And again, it's a pattern that's very typical for patients affected by body dysmorphic disorder. But again, I just wasn't told about it. I heard of BDD before, but I didn't realize how common it was in patients looking to undergo cosmetic procedures. And I didn't understand the risk involved. I didn't know that the majority, like 98% of patients affected by BDD, don't benefit from cosmetic procedures because they literally cannot see the difference. Like, you're chasing an emotional relief, but that can't be delivered by a physical change that you can't see. So yeah, no one really told me about it, and I just found out sometime later when I was talking to a friend and was obviously really depressed and was kind of blaming the surgeon for, you know, oh, I'm going to have another surgery with another surgeon who will do it right. And that's when my friend was like, oh, did you hear about BDD? Because that sounds like something that you're very clearly affected by. And it wasn't until then that I looked into it and kind of, you know, understood. Everything kind of fell into place, and that's kind of the first time I realized I might need like some sort of psychological support and medication and not cosmetic surgery. So having had that experience, I later on wanted to do something about it when I was kind of looking at the aesthetic sector and realized that this is so common and there are no safeguards in place. At best, what practitioners do is screening, if any. Again, this is, you know, I wish it was used more than it is, but actually it turns out that screening is not the way to do this because it doesn't capture the patient's, like, anyway, so that's the chapter. That's how I got into it. And seeing that there were no practical safeguards to kind of prevent people from going through the experience that I've had to go through, I wanted to do something about that. And that's how I started looking at the market and kind of figure out, you know, what can be done. So PREPARE started as a, you know, like the simple idea was, okay, well, this is an issue, so let's see if we can put in psychological screening. As I looked more into it, it turns out psychological screening doesn't work in aesthetics because patients have every incentive to just say whatever in order to get the procedure that they believe is in their best interest. So
do you have personal experience of that?
No, absolutely. That's something that I can completely relate, that it wouldn't matter whether you put a detailed assessment in front of me or a questionnaire. I would have just said whatever would get me the procedure. It's almost like a feature of the disorder itself that you don't, like, it's similar to, I guess BDD is something people can't necessarily relate to, but it's similar as with eating disorders like anorexia, where people could be dangerously underweight, but they literally cannot see it. And it doesn't matter how much evidence you put in front of them, they still can't see it. And with body dysmorphia, it's kind of a similar thing. Like, you just believe that this surgery will fix all of your problems, but it doesn't. And the issue with screenings and assessments is it kind of gives all the power to the practitioners who are not qualified to assess or diagnose psychological issues, because most of them may be medical doctors, but they're not psychologists and they're not psychiatrists. So the issue with screening tools is they are typically based on the DSM-5 criteria that is made for psychiatrists to help them standardize diagnoses of issues that they're actually qualified to diagnose. But
sorry, what's the you mentioned DSM-5
criteria?
Yeah,
sorry, it's the diagnostic manual. So again, it's just the any psychological disorder that's covered in the DSM, like depression, obsessive compulsive disorders, anxiety. Basically, there's a set of criteria of the symptoms that kind of helps psychiatrists standardize the assessments. But again, when we're talking about psychiatrists and psychologists, they are qualified to assess and diagnose these issues. Cosmetic practitioners unless they have mental health background, can't use that.
When we're talking about aesthetic practitioners, because I know there's a lot of talk in the industry about regulation at the moment, are we talking about aesthetic technicians, nurses, doctors, and is there a difference between their skill set when screening and safeguarding?
So, I mean, I guess you would... So I don't typically... I put all aesthetic practitioners in the same bucket. I tend to focus on the healthcare professionals, so not necessarily non-medics, even though they do make up a fair share of the market. But so anything from doctors, surgeons, nurses, dentists, anyone who performs injectable procedures, or generally I focus on injectable procedures, but also cosmetic surgery, like the actual surgical procedures. I don't think there's necessarily a difference in the approach to safeguarding, like the psychological safeguarding. I think because the industry as a whole is so poorly regulated when it comes to physical safety, I focus solely on the psychological safety, which again kind of applies to, you know, it's similar to across procedures, but there isn't necessarily a difference between how individual practitioners approach it. As I said, most don't really do anything. In most consultations, patients may be asked, why do you want this, or how long you've been thinking about it. There's been studies about this, and the sensitivity of practitioners for detecting body dysmorphic disorder in patients is about 4%.
Wow.
Which is nothing. So,
and is there any training on this in the undergraduate courses or postgraduate courses?
So I like to see that body dysmorphic disorder is often covered in like a small psychological module, and there are some, you know, I mean, it should be a part of cosmetic courses, because patient motivations are like, that's all that matters when it comes to cosmetic procedures, right? Cosmetic procedures aren't a healthcare necessity. They're all about the patient's psychological drivers and their motivations. So you would expect them to be explored in a bit more structured way, but there is only that much that cosmetic consultations allow for, given that they're normally like 30 minutes, an hour at the most. And in that time, the practitioner has to go through, you know, physical risks, the patient's medical history, and they can't realistically assess the patient's mental state. And obviously, that's what I was saying about the key limitation of self-report questionnaires. They rely on the patient giving them honest answers. And in cosmetic settings, the patient has absolutely no incentive to provide honest answers, especially if it may surface that their expectations may be unrealistic, or perhaps their motivations may be unhealthy, or perhaps they're quite distressed about their appearance, so they're putting a lot of weight on the outcome of this procedure that they want. That's kind of how I started of, you know, okay, can we make screening work? Can we add more questions? Can we make it a little less obvious where these questions are going?
You mentioned that the patient obviously has a motivation to answer screening question, or the current screening questions, in a certain way to get the procedure. Is there, and I suspect we probably don't want to think this, but is there a motivation from the medic or the aesthetics consultant to turn a blind eye, encourage them to have a procedure? I'm thinking from a financial gain point of view. It's not something we want to think happens.
Exactly. I mean, exactly. Yeah, it's not something we want to admit. It's not something the industry wants to admit. You've probably seen it at all the medical aesthetics conferences, and you know, most of the industry bodies, they're sort of trying to rebrand aesthetics as a sector or a specialty, and there are people who refuse to call it an industry because they say this isn't an industry, because that implies it's all commercially driven, and they want to call aesthetics healthcare. And while there's definitely skills, like technical skills required to do these procedures safely, it's what I said earlier about medical or sort of healthcare versus cosmetic. Cosmetic procedures aren't medically necessary, right? Nobody needs a straighter nose or bigger boobs or more hair or bigger lips or smoother skin. They're not a necessity. It's all about what the patient wants. It's all driven by their internal motivations and psychological drivers. And so if you want to call aesthetics healthcare, then the question that presents itself is, well, what are you treating? And again, things like self-confidence and self-esteem and body image, those are valid. Those are valid motivations, but why is there no structured way to kind of explore those and ensure that the patient will in fact benefit from whatever procedure you're performing? Again, not to say that everyone is purely commercially motivated, but very sadly, a lot of practitioners are. And it's something that I came across repeatedly when I was kind of promoting this patient well-being or patient safeguarding tool with practitioners asking, okay, but how does this make me money? How does this drive revenue? And it's like, it's not here to drive revenue. It's here to protect your patients. It's here to support informed consent. So that's kind of that is the one single most disappointing thing I found in my time within this industry, that patient safety or sort of the psychological safeguarding tends to stop at lip service. Because you see so many practitioners talking about it and, giving talks about BDD despite having no experience or expertise on the subject. And they're just kind of going by their experience of, oh, I've never ever had a BDD patient in my practice. Or they expect that they will be able to spot body dysmorphia.
I was going to say, is that they haven't had one or they've just not recognised it?
Exactly, but it's the same thing as saying you can always spot depression or OCD or PTSD or ADHD. They're psychological things, you can't spot them. You might be able to spot someone suffering from depression in certain situations, right? If they suffer from really, really deep depression and that it's the sort of stereotypical thing that you imagine of someone just lying in bed, not willing to get up. But that's not what depression is. Just as BDD isn't as severe as people imagine it is, as in outwardly. It's just not something you can spot from the outside. And very often patients themselves aren't aware that they're affected by it. And that was exactly my personal experience, where I didn't realize that this was a diagnosable condition. And I learned to hide any kind of distress. Because, especially, so there's no single cause of BDD, but a lot of people sort of develop preoccupation with appearance because they perhaps have experienced bullying or comments about their appearance since they were very young. I've had like the exact opposite thing. I've always been told, oh, you're so pretty, you're gonna have an easy life and everything. And then I see how people who aren't conventionally attractive get treated, and you're like, I don't want that. And that kind of drove that preoccupation with appearance, not necessarily in a negative way, but it just led me to associate my self-worth with exclusively what I look like. And obviously that then makes you preoccupied with your looks, and it's kind of all that matters.
So before we sort of jump into how you came on to launch PREPÄRE and what it is, tell me a bit more about the connection between body dysmorphia and mental health. Do you always have depression or anxiety or a mental health condition with it? Is that a precursor to it? What's the connection?
So typically body dysmorphia is described as preoccupation with appearance that causes distress. Very often it's described as like disproportionate distress about features that others would deem minor. And so you often have people who look conventionally attractive, but they're actually deeply dissatisfied and distressed about what they look like, but their perception is not necessarily accurate. Like they see a completely different thing to what others see. Again, this is just me kind of trying to help people understand what it feels like, but it's kind of like OCD, but instead of focusing on whatever germs or odor or a specific thing, you focus on appearance. So it's like that compulsive checking, the distress that comes with it, the way it affects your life. It is isolating and it is kind of overwhelming because it's the center of your entire existence and it's difficult to focus on anything else. And so that is why people with BDD are driven to cosmetic procedures, because changing the aspect of appearance that bothers them seems like the obvious solution. But because there is, I mean, very often there is no flaw to correct. There isn't anything objective that needs changing. It is in your head. That's why cosmetic procedures in the majority of cases, in like 96 to 98% of cases, don't resolve that distress. The pattern is typically for BDD patients to feel like an immediate sense of short-lived relief after a procedure, and then the preoccupation either moves on to another part of the body or it comes back because you literally cannot see any difference. If it's very severe, it might affect people's ability to go out and socialize and work. But in many cases, it's purely internal. Like in my case, it definitely has led to me being deeply depressed, and it has literally just controlled my life for a long time. But at the same time, I was able to study and I was able to work. It was a lot harder than it should have been, but nobody would be able to tell. That's kind of my point, and that's why the assumptions of practitioners who say, I can spot this in patients because, you know, they always open up to me and they're always visibly distressed, or you can see that the distress is disproportionate to the feature they want to change. That's not how it manifests in all cases. It's just the tip of the iceberg. What you see is the tip of the iceberg. So,
and how many people does this affect? And is there a particular does it affect men more than women? A particular age range? What's the prevalence?
So it's like a lot of mental health issues that kind of develops in adolescence. So you have people who suffered from it from like early teens, but it can develop later on in life. It seems to affect men and women more or less equally, but the features it focuses on are often different. So for women, it's kind of everything, every part of the body. Whereas for men, it's often stuff like muscularity and hair loss. And again, it's kind of what you'd expect by the beauty standards and the direction they push us in. But there is no typical BDD patient. It can affect anyone. And again, as I said, and as was my case, it is very well disguised, to a point where no one, not your family, not your closest friends, and certainly not an aesthetic practitioner, would be able to tell that you're dealing with this.
Fascinating. So I feel like we've kept everyone on tenterhooks around what PREPARE actually is. Really interesting background on body dysmorphia. I've certainly learned a lot. Tell us about PREPARE and how that is the sort of solution or starting point to resolving some of these issues.
The core premise is that if practitioners can't identify things like body dysmorphia or unrealistic motivations or any other psychological distress that might affect the patient's satisfaction with procedures, then they shouldn't be held accountable for spotting it, but they should be held accountable for disclosing it. And it seems so obvious when you kind of put it in front of people now, but my belief is that psychological risks should be a standard part of informed consent, right? So I compare it to physical risks. Practitioners must disclose the risk of, scarring, swelling, bruising, allergies. So to put this into perspective, when it comes to like facial treatments and injectables, patients, about 3%, less than 3% of patients are at risk of an allergic reaction. Right now, compare that to body dysmorphic disorder, which is thought to affect between like 19 and 24% of cosmetic patients. So it's like 1 in 5. and
significant statistic.
Significant. And that is associated, as I say, about 98-ish% of those either see their mental health worsen, or they see no improvement in their symptoms, or it just moves on to another feature. So you could say that, generally speaking, patients affected by body dysmorphia don't benefit from cosmetic procedures. So you basically have 1 in 5 patients who don't benefit from these procedures, but that's not disclosed. It's not necessarily going to prevent patients from going ahead with procedures. However, it should help patients spot the pattern if they've had a procedure and don't see the benefit, or become more distressed, or just become preoccupied with another part of their body. That would be the moment to think about it and think, I was told about this thing called BDD that I may actually be affected by. So it really is just that disclosure that just seems like a no-brainer. So what PREPARE does, it focuses on psychological risk disclosure and education before the consultations. It is sent to patients before they come in for consultation. So patients just click on a link and they're taken to this page where they basically have like a mini 3 to 4 minute conversation without the pressure of in-person questioning, without knowing that anyone will review these answers. It can be anonymous for them. It literally just tells them about the risks, and the education is delivered regardless of how patients answer questions. So again, you kind of make it personalized by asking questions about how long have they been thinking about this procedure, have they had other procedures before, were they satisfied with them, stuff that practitioners should already be asking in consultations, and many of them are. Most of them are not documenting it though, which is where this becomes very relevant to
so you're
insurers.
capturing the information from the patient directly prior to the consultation.
Prior, but it's not like the information capture is there, but the key aspect of this is it's not a one-way questionnaire that just collects information from the patient. It outputs the feedback that puts things into perspective for the patient in a very simple, easy to understand way. That again, this should be done in consultations, but again, practitioners aren't qualified to do this, and they're under time constraint and commercial pressure to run the consultations in a certain way. So nobody is sitting these patients down and kind of having the conversation where they say, this is a thing that affects this many patients, and this is how it manifests, and this is why it matters in this context. This is why you may not benefit. So if you find yourself struggling after this procedure, it may be time to perhaps seek some sort of psychological support rather than get another procedure or go to another practitioner, because that's what often happens in those cases. Patients get more and more procedures because they can't necessarily see, it's not bringing the emotional relief that they were hoping for. And instead of recognizing it as a psychological pattern, they think, the practitioner must have done something wrong.
It's an interesting point. You mention that, what I picked out from that is it can actually be a safeguarding tool for the practitioner as well. So you mentioned the struggle with presumably business owners, practitioners asking, how does this help me make more money? But actually, if a body dysmorphia patient is unsatisfied with their treatment and that leads to a claim or a complaint, surely your tool is helping to prevent or minimise that.
Yeah, absolutely. And that is why I'm now speaking to insurers. Because dissatisfaction and unmanaged expectations and gaps in informed consent are the most common drivers of claims in the cosmetic space. So the reason this tool is relevant to insurers and why it is commercially beneficial to practitioners who, tend to overestimate their ability to spot patient concerns, like there isn't really a objectively good outcome. Like good cosmetic outcome is whatever the patient says is a good outcome. So it is risky for the practitioner because they can do absolutely everything right. They can perform procedure perfectly and, get what most would consider objectively great results. But if that patient suffers from body dysmorphia, or if they were driven by other psychological factors, you know, a lot of people in the patient population suffer from depression and anxiety, not necessarily appearance related, but it's a really common factor in decision making to get cosmetic procedures. And these patients often end up being dissatisfied. Those are the patients who bring claims forward based on, you know, this procedure hasn't delivered what I wanted it to. I'm really struggling with the gaps in data because you see general medical malpractice claims, but you can only estimate how many of those are for cosmetic procedures. And you can then only estimate how many of those, I mean, I guess there is data on how frequently things like emotional injury or emotional distress or informed consent come up in these claims. And it generally, it's very common, both in the UK and in the US. As I said, the practitioner can do everything right. There is no objective reason to dispute the outcome of a procedure, but patients still do because they weren't warned about the psychological risks. They weren't warned that they may not be satisfied. They were not warned that it's not going to magically fix their life, which again sounds obvious, but if you're affected by BDD, you genuinely expect that. And what you mentioned earlier about the kind of the commercial incentive of the practitioners, you actually see that quite often, where even when you go through the websites of different clinics and surgeons, where they really lean hard into the get your confidence back, you know, like get your, like that is almost like a promised outcome.
Well, that's going to appeal if you're...
Well, exactly. But it's, again, to compare that to the physical risk disclosures, right? There's a reason why that's mandatory. You have to disclose it because patients need that information in order to make an informed decision. They need to know about the physical risks. They need to know the risks of, you know, whatever the common side effects and complications are.
So how do you know your product works? It might seem like a
Is
tough
honestly,
question.
No, that is a tough question. And I mean, again...
is it experiential? Is it backed in evidence?
It's backed in evidence that's available. It's going to require more data. That's why I'm now running pilot studies to get the data. But again, because claims reductions is a long-term thing, it's something that you kind of have to wait and see. So, yeah, I mean, tough question. In theory, it works, right? In theory, it makes sense that it's something that should be disclosed because it then protects the, as you say, it does protect the practitioner.
So where are you on your journey? Is the product sort of on the market, being actively used? How many practices have adopted it? And what's the early feedback been?
So I've kind of changed the model halfway through from selling it directly to practitioners, and I've had a few practices sending it out to patients. That really was just to test that the admin isn't, because a safeguard's only useful if it's actually applied in practice, right? If practitioners aren't using it, then there's no point. So that's why, again, early versions of it, and it's gone through iterations and iterations, because what I had to do is reduce the operational burden on clinics to the absolute minimum. The stage I'm at now, I'm speaking to underwriters and US-based insurers to basically pay for a license to apply it in their insured clinics. And then the burden's very low on the clinics themselves. They just send out links to their patients. And that should keep the data coming in. And hopefully in some amount of time, I'll be able to tell whether this works. But I have been told before that I'm kind of working on a solution to a problem that the industry isn't recognizing as much as they should be. So I'm kind of a step ahead to where the industry is at right now. When I speak to like lawyers representing patients and also defense counsel for insurers, they say they've only just started seeing that practitioners are disclosing physical risks properly. And there are still parts of the world, like there's one lawyer that I've spoken to recently, and she works between London and Dubai, and she said in Dubai, practitioners aren't disclosing physical risks because they think that's going to put patients off from coming to them and going ahead with procedures. And obviously that's exactly the point. But that's kind of where we're at with psychological risks, where practitioners don't want to disclose them because they are worried that it will put patients off or scare them off of getting procedures. But again, it's just the crucial piece of information that patients need to know. But anyway, yeah, so dealing with insurers, running pilot trials to get some more tangible data to be able to really point to the benefit. But it's a long-term game.
Who's been the hardest to convince? Because obviously you've designed this with patients, practice owners or clinicians and insurers in mind.
Yeah.
Where are the greatest barriers?
So honestly, the insurance angle came into it relatively recently. At first, it was obviously from my patient experience and a group of patient ambassadors and a bunch of mental health professionals who focus on body image issues. And then obviously I've worked with practitioners to understand where it fits into their consultations. Practitioners definitely were the hardest to convince, again, because so many of the conversations I've had, pretty much all of them were overwhelmingly positive. You know, everyone will tell you this is so important, you know, patient mental health is the key to everything. We have to take better care of the patients. But then that's what I said about it being mostly lip service and sadly not translating into action on the practitioner's part. So even when I was testing the early versions of the product, I would ask practitioners to just use it for free, right? To just, you know, add this to your CRM system or add it to your template that you send out to patients. And that's kind of all you have to do. And even that is not easy to just get them to do that because they are worried it will affect their bottom line. So even though it does benefit them, right? Even if it puts off the patients who perhaps do recognize themselves in some of these issues that are brought to them and think, maybe I shouldn't have this procedure, that does affect the practitioners and they don't like not having the control over it. And that is why I changed the target audience, and instead of trying to convince practitioners who ask stupid questions like how does this make me money, which should be the last of their concerns, right? But I mean, it isn't, and okay. But that's why the insurers are much, much easier to convince. Like I've actually been approached by insurers to kind of say, oh, you know, if we can strengthen the informed consent documentation and if we can address the factors that most commonly drive claims, even though there's no technical error on the practitioner's part, even though there are no physical complications, it's simply that the patient is dissatisfied because they were never suitable to have this procedure in the first place. So that obviously does have an impact on insurers financially because they ideally, again, I don't have data to prove it, but in theory it should reduce the claim frequency and it should reduce the claim severity. So is that where you're looking to take your commercial model? Because obviously we live in a sad world where money talks. Who stands to gain financially from adopting your tool? Is it the insurance market that you're primarily targeting? I mean, again, I would say it's a win for everyone, right? Because obviously patients get better educated. They perhaps realize that they may have mental health issues that they should address. So patient safeguarding is still at the core of it. Commercially, it does obviously benefit the practitioners, I guess you would say, from the more intangible reputational protection. When something goes wrong for a surgeon or cosmetic practitioner, it typically is the insurer that pays, right? Because if there is a complaint, if there is a claim made against them, if that goes to court, it's not the practitioner themselves that pay it, it's the insurer that ends up paying for defense, and they're the ones who end up paying indemnity if it comes to it. But all those costs are on the insurer. And I mean, I guess the practitioner may feel it by eventually getting their premiums raised, but...
And is this a philanthropic project, or is this designed as a commercial project to make money?
So honestly, because it started as a passion project, then kind of turned into business, then kind of turned into like it's not necessarily about the money. I want this to happen because it's something I needed. So I've kind of separated this into, so as a short answer, no, Prepare is a business. It's intended to make profit. I have moved all the advocacy work and the kind of the patient awareness and under Index MH, which is my non-profit, and that focuses on a slightly different thing, but that's basically where most of the patient advocacy and mental health awareness sits now, whereas Prepare I have kept as risk mitigation infrastructure for insurers underwriting cosmetic medical professionals. It
sounds expensive to develop. How are you funding this?
So I have, so all of it is bootstrapped. One thing I have learned from all the entrepreneurs I have worked with while I was at Barclays Private Bank was I had a lot of regrets about taking VC funding and taking on board investors that perhaps weren't perfectly aligned with the founder and their vision and the product or the business. So I very intentionally stayed away from raising funding. And again, it's something that I'm trying to put off for as long as I can. It's probably not as expensive to run as you would think because I do most things myself. Okay. So again, it's not something that because it's all digital. Like there is no, it's not exactly a kind of capital intensive project. It involves a ton of research, a ton of literature review, a lot of, well, I mean, I guess some technical skills when it comes to stuff like building websites and sort of the digital infrastructure, but I have learned to do that myself. I basically try to do as much as I can on my own, and then when I need expert input, that's the point where I kind of get someone to consult on it. Or obviously, because a lot of what I do is quite sensitive because it's to do with kind of mental health support or patient advice, I obviously want that to be grounded in evidence and not just kind of, you know, one person trying to play a therapist. So that's where I do invite mental health professionals and kind of academics to consult on this and basically give it the thumbs up and say, yes, this is fine. And yeah, then AI tools have been super useful, again, because this is something like what I do is so niche and it doesn't really have an equivalent or a competitor out there. It's kind of, new ground to pave. I think I'm one of the founders that actually gets to do this because I don't have kids, I don't have dependents, I don't have a mortgage to pay. It's quite flexible for me to just kind of let it go wherever it goes, you know, just like go with the flow and see where it ends up. So yeah, because my time is basically the main expense, it is possible to bootstrap it.
You touched on AI, which is obviously a very hot topic at the moment. How are you using that within the platform, and are you developing your own language models underneath it, or are you relying on products that are out there? I'm intrigued how that's how you're aligning AI with your product.
Yeah, so I know a lot of businesses will call themselves AI powered because they use ChatGPT to guide parts of their development. So I wouldn't call it an AI based business. I mean, there are obviously elements of AI, so I use both ChatGPT and Claude and Perplexity and a bunch of other large language models on a daily basis. That's basically my team. And it is incredibly useful because for relatively little money, it does give you pretty much unlimited access to information and you know, all the research and literature that you have to go through to kind of inform decisions.
But are you using that to help you develop the product, or is it actually integrated into the product?
I wouldn't say it's integrated into the product. Again, it depends how you define AI, right? I said the tool itself, that, you know, that it's kind of like a chatbot that gets sent to patients, but
I think that's what I was interested in finding out, is how the interaction between the patient and your platform works. And are there any risks associated with AI being part of that process and perhaps giving wrong information? And how have you mitigated
exactly.
that?
So that was actually one of the main concerns, and so that is why AI isn't part of the patient-facing aspect of this. As I say, it's a fixed algorithm, so it is quite complex, but it's not generative AI. It doesn't make up its own answers. When it comes to the actual patient pre-consultation check-in, it's kind of like a questionnaire. So the patients are given options and they select an option. And again, kind of the reason behind that, obviously part of it is data protection and not having people input their personal information of any kind, but also to keep it very tightly controlled what is actually displayed to the patient, because you don't want to risk an AI language model kind of giving advice that may not be 100% correct. So that's why I decided to go with fixed algorithm rather than something generative, because there is a risk when it comes to mental health.
And talking of mental health, you mentioned IndexMH, your mental health charity. How does that project differ from what you're doing with PREPARE? You can tell me a bit more about that.
Yeah, so IndexMH is a non-profit certification body. It's kind of modeled after B Corp, but instead of sustainability, it focuses on mental health impact. So it focuses on the beauty industry as a whole, not just medical aesthetics, but also fashion, cosmetics, makeup, wellness, anything that uses people's body image to sell something. So I know that could be, the scope for that is quite wide, but I think because the beauty industry is based on that, that's where the main focus is. And that's still in the early stages and still developing, but basically I have a board, an advisory board made up of mental health experts and academics. There are a lot of researchers that focus on body image research specifically, and how things like media and advertising affects our body image and mental health. And the goal for that is to come up with very clear certification criteria that different companies can meet. So for example, we're starting with Body Image Safe, which is going to be a certification for physical fashion stores. So any kind of fashion brand with physical retail location. And it's looking at things that have been shown to affect our body image in store. So it's stuff like mannequins, language used throughout the store, and like signs, the sizing ranges, the imagery in store, the changing rooms, the placement of mirrors. Overall, there's, I think the base is 7 or 8 criteria that kind of cover these things, and they're very simple to assess just by kind of walking into a store and say whether the store meets them or not. But the theory behind it is, again, things like, for example, the imagery in store, who is shown, who is given the space, and in advertisements, etc. It kind of sends a deeper message, not just, here, this is close, but it kind of signals what is desirable. And again, that's how you then have people kind of associating what they look like with their sense of self-worth and feeling like they are or aren't fitting in. And again, there's a big push for diversity in advertisements, but there's a lot of, I don't think anyone's yet coined the term, but like the equivalent of greenwashing, but when it comes to diversity and inclusion, where a lot of brands kind of display, you know, different skin types and body types, but it's all tokenistic. It's just like, you know, here's a conventionally attractive model. We're still saying the majority of people should look like this, and also here's a model that looks slightly different, just so that we've ticked the box. But you can kind of spot that quite easily. So the idea behind Index MH is to give consumers a very simple way to spot companies that take their mental health seriously.
It sounds like you're on quite a mission.
Yes.
And you're tackling a huge problem in quite a major industry. Do you ever waver in your conviction?
Not in the conviction. I think I know why I'm doing what I'm doing, and it does get exhausting. But again, I think everyone gets tired of whatever, you know, like it's an uphill battle. And again, it's trying to push for something that doesn't yet exist and isn't as well known as it should be. And it's kind of what I said about trying to sell a solution to a problem that isn't yet completely visible, or not the extent of it. So part of selling the solution is actually highlighting the problem. You know, I mean, you can see very clear trends in litigation and with body dysmorphic disorder and general psychological factors becoming more and more prevalent as people are becoming more aware of it, and the fact they weren't told about the risks, and the fact that they weren't told about that this may not fix their life. It's growing. It's all growing, and it's going to get to a point where it just cannot be ignored anymore.
So what does the industry look like in 5 to 10 years if platforms like PREPARE are successful and do what they are intended to do? And how does that align with the recent regulatory changes that are being proposed and hopefully taking effect within the industry?
Yeah, so regulation is like a whole another thing. And again, as I said, most of the focus right now is on the physical safety and who's actually able to practice. I think I often compare the industry to like a house being built without plumbing and then realizing, oh, you need plumbing. As in, psychological factors drive the desire for patients to go for these procedures. So without having the psychological factors addressed right at the beginning, everything's, you know, like you've not done the basics. So obviously something's going to go wrong. So it's hard to tell. I hope that with time, psychological risk disclosure will become a standard part of the informed consent process. That is something that I would like to hear. Is that going to come from the regulators? Honestly, we've been waiting for regulation for decades, and it is moving very slowly, as you'd expect. So that's why I'm not really putting too much faith in the regulators. I'm focused on the people with the immediate commercial incentive, which is the insurers. You know, they could just underwrite this into a policy and say, you must disclose psychological risks, you must adequately prepare patients for these procedures, and that obviously should prevent a whole bunch of issues. But anyway, God knows how long that's going to take.
I'm intrigued to know, when you embarked on this project and you took what is quite a major leap, did you have a safety net?
Not really. As I said, I kind of thought, well, this is really important to me. I don't want to be working for a big corporation where I'm just kind of a small cog in a wheel. I mean, I guess a lot of founders have this, where they want to have control over what they do, and they kind of want to be their own boss. And it comes with benefits, it comes with big risks. Obviously, the financial risk of you don't know when your next paycheck is coming in is that's a major thing to consider. Again, for me, because of the position I'm in, as in I don't really have financial commitments that would prevent me from, like I'm quite flexible when it comes to, as I said, like I don't have kids to pay for, I don't have a mortgage to pay, I just pay rent and kind of, do what I have to do. I've got savings, that's kind of what keeps me going. If I have to do contract work in the future, I will, because that for me would be, I think, preferred at this stage to raising funding.
I think it's a fantastic project, and I think you will make waves in the industry and hopefully get there. A final question. We ask all of our guests, what piece of kit, information, tool or advice do you think is essential for anyone looking to take a similar leap?
I don't think there's one single thing I would point to. Again, it probably really depends on the industry you operate in. As I said, I'm a big fan of AI tools. Obviously, the big caveat there is that you have the things you input, it gives you the output. So it's all kind of based on how you use things. But I think AI tools like ChatGPT, like Claude, like Perplexity are incredibly valuable, because it's basically like having a little team of, well, I wouldn't say experts, but it does help a lot.
Thank you very much. I've really enjoyed our conversation. I feel I've learnt a lot. Brea, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
If you've enjoyed this episode of The Leap, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss future conversations. Follow Virillo on LinkedIn for more insight, advice and honest thinking on the realities of buying, selling and growing clinics. And if today's conversation has got you thinking about a leap of your own, remember, it's rarely simple, but with the right perspective and support, it can be the most rewarding step you'll ever take. This is The Leap from Virillo. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.